How much betrayal can a mother's heart endure before love transforms into flames? What happens when the woman who raised your children discovers your darkest secret? In 1824, Clara had been like family to the Ashworth plantation for 15 years, trusted with their children, their secrets, their lives. But when she learned what Master James had done to her own daughter, trust became tinder. That winter night, she turned the mansion into a funeral pyre with the family sleeping inside. This is the story of a woman who chose fire over forgiveness. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button for more untold stories. Clara's hands were still warm from tucking little Mary Ashworth into bed when she found the letter. It was December 15th, 1824, and snow had begun to dust the windows of the Ashworth mansion in Savannah, Georgia. The house felt peaceful, filled with the quiet breathing of sleeping children and the distant crackle of dying embers in the fireplace downstairs. Clara had just finished her nightly ritual of checking each room, ensuring every child was safe, every blanket pulled tight against the winter cold. She had done this same routine for 15 years, ever since she first arrived at the plantation as a young woman of 19. But tonight was different. Tonight, as she passed Master James Ashworth's study, she noticed candlelight still flickering beneath the door. This was unusual. James always retired early, especially during the winter months when the plantation work slowed. Clara hesitated in the hallway, her bare feet silent on the polished wooden floors. Something about the silence felt wrong, charged with a tension she couldn't name. That's when she heard it. The soft scratch of a pen on paper, then a muffled sob that made her blood freeze. The sound wasn't coming from James. It was coming from someone else in the room with him. Clara pressed her ear to the heavy oak door, her heart beginning to race. The voice belonged to a woman, young and broken, pleading in whispers Clara couldn't quite make out. But there was something familiar about that voice, something that made Clara's maternal instincts scream in alarm. She had raised 6 children in this house, had learned to distinguish their cries from 3 rooms away. This wasn't one of the Ashworth children. This was someone else entirely. Against every rule she had learned in 15 years of slavery, Clara slowly turned the door handle. The study was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the walls lined with leather-bound books and hunting trophies. James sat behind his mahogany desk, fully dressed despite the late hour, while across from him sat a young woman Clara didn't immediately recognize. The woman's back was to the door, but Clara could see her shoulders shaking with silent tears. Papers were scattered across the desk between them, and James was counting out gold coins with the methodical precision of a man conducting business. That's when the young woman turned slightly and Clara's world collapsed. The profile was unmistakable, even after 4 years apart. It was Ruth, Clara's own daughter, the child who had been sold away when she turned 16 to pay off James Ashworth's gambling debts. Ruth, who Clara had been told was living safely on a tobacco farm in North Carolina. Ruth, who Clara had spent countless nights praying for, hoping she was being treated with kindness by strangers. But Ruth wasn't in North Carolina. She was here in this study, and the way she held herself, the way her dress hung loose and torn, told Clara everything she needed to know about what had been happening. James looked up and saw Clara in the doorway. For a moment their eyes met across the candlelit room, and Clara saw something she had never seen before in the man she had served faithfully for 15 years. Fear, raw, desperate fear of being discovered. But it lasted only a second before his expression hardened into the cold authority Clara knew so well. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same tone he used when disciplining the field slaves. "You're not supposed to be here." Ruth turned around completely then, and Clara saw her daughter's face for the first time in 4 years. She was 20 now, but looked older, worn down by experiences Clara didn't want to imagine. Ruth's eyes widened when she saw her mother, and her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she looked back and forth between Clara and James as if caught between salvation and damnation. "What is she doing here?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with trembling hands. The papers on James's desk caught her attention, and she could make out enough words to understand they were legal documents. Sale papers, transfer of ownership. Her daughter was being sold again, but to whom? And why was this transaction happening in secret in the middle of the night? James stood up from his chair, his tall frame casting long shadows in the flickering candlelight. "This doesn't concern you, Clara. Ruth is no longer your responsibility. She hasn't been for 4 years." His words were measured, careful, but Clara could hear the tension underneath. He was trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his grasp. "She's my daughter," Clara said, and for the first time in 15 years of slavery, she didn't lower her eyes when speaking to her master. "She will always be my responsibility." Clara moved closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the papers spread across its surface. What she read there made her stomach turn. Ruth wasn't being sold to another plantation. She was being sold to a brothel in New Orleans, a place where young women disappeared forever into lives of degradation and early death. The room fell silent except for the soft crackling of the fireplace and Ruth's quiet sobbing. Clara looked at James, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. This man who had trusted her with his children's lives, who had praised her cooking at countless dinner parties, who had even allowed her small privileges like learning to read from the children's books, had been planning to condemn her daughter to a fate worse than death. And from the guilty expression on his face, Clara realized this wasn't the first time. How many other daughters had he sold into such darkness? "The children love you," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying a strange calm that surprised even her. "Mary still calls for you every night when she has nightmares. Little James brings you his broken toys to fix. Elizabeth asks me every day when you'll teach her piano again." She paused, watching James's face carefully. They would be heartbroken to know what their father really is. Something shifted in James's expression. The fear returned, stronger this time, mixed with a rage Clara had seen directed at field slaves who dared to look him in the eye. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "After everything I've given you, after all the privileges, all the trust." Clara almost laughed at the bitter irony. Privileges, trust, words that meant nothing when they could be revoked at any moment, when they had never extended to protecting her own child. "I trusted you too," she said simply. "I trusted you with my daughter's life." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Ruth suddenly stood up from her chair, swaying slightly as if she might faint. "Mama," she whispered, and the word carried 4 years of separation, pain, and desperate longing. Clara moved toward her daughter instinctively, but James stepped between them, his hand moving to the pistol he always kept on his desk. "Don't," he said, and Clara couldn't tell if he was speaking to her or to Ruth or to himself. "This transaction is legal. I have every right to dispose of my property as I see fit." But his voice lacked conviction. They all knew that what was happening in this room went far beyond legal property transfers. This was about power, control, and the systematic destruction of families for profit. Clara looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw marks on Ruth's wrists that looked like rope burns. She saw the way Ruth held herself, protective and wounded. She saw the resignation in her daughter's eyes, the acceptance of a fate that no mother should ever witness. In that moment, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't let her daughter disappear into the darkness of New Orleans. She wouldn't let James Ashworth continue destroying lives while hiding behind the mask of respectability. "I'll go," Clara said suddenly, causing both James and Ruth to look at her in surprise. "I'll leave the plantation tonight. Take Ruth with me. You'll never see either of us again." It was a desperate gambit, but Clara knew she had one advantage James couldn't ignore. She knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. 15 years of managing his household had given her access to secrets that could destroy his reputation in Savannah society. James considered this for a long moment, and Clara could see him weighing his options. He could have her whipped, killed, or sold for even suggesting such a thing. But he could also let her disappear quietly, along with the inconvenient evidence of his nighttime business dealings. For a moment, Clara thought he might agree. She saw something like relief cross his features as he imagined being free of witnesses to his crimes. Then Ruth spoke, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of 4 years of suffering. "Mama, there are others, other girls from other plantations. He keeps them in the old tobacco warehouse by the river." Ruth's words hung in the air like an accusation, and Clara felt her last hopes for a peaceful resolution crumble. This wasn't just about one transaction or even one daughter. This was about a systematic operation that had been going on for years, right under everyone's noses. James's face went white with fury, and his hand closed around the pistol grip. "You stupid girl," he hissed at Ruth. "You've just killed us all." The mask was completely off now, and Clara saw the man her master really was underneath the veneer of Southern gentility. A predator who had used his position and authority to prey on the most vulnerable members of society, all while maintaining the facade of a respectable family man. Clara's mind raced as she processed this new information. Other girls. A warehouse. How many families had been torn apart to feed James's greed? How many daughters had disappeared while their mothers wondered and grieved? The scope of the betrayal was staggering, and Clara felt something inside her break and reshape itself into something harder, more dangerous. "Where are the keys to the warehouse?" Clara asked, her voice eerily calm. She had moved beyond anger into a cold, calculating fury that surprised her with its clarity. James looked at her as if she had lost her mind, which perhaps she had. After all, what slave dared to interrogate her master about criminal activities? "You're not going anywhere," James said, raising the pistol to point directly at Clara's chest. "Neither of you are leaving this room alive. There's too much at stake." Clara could see he meant it. The desperation in his eyes told her that he would rather commit murder than face exposure. She had pushed him too far, cornered him like a dangerous animal. But Clara had spent 15 years studying this man, learning his habits, his weaknesses, his fears. She knew that he was a coward at heart, that his cruelty came from a position of safety and power. Take away that safety and he became unpredictable, prone to mistakes. She also knew something James had forgotten in his panic. They weren't alone in this house. Upstairs, 6 children slept peacefully, unaware that their world was about to change forever. And Clara knew each of those children better than their own father did. "Mary," Clara said quietly, and James's face went pale as he realized what she was doing. "Sweet little Mary who wakes up screaming from nightmares about monsters under her bed. Do you know what she told me last week? She said the monsters look just like you." Clara took a step closer to James, the pistol now only inches from her chest. "She's been having those dreams for months now, James. Months. What do you think happens when I'm not there to comfort her anymore?" The psychological warfare was deliberate and devastating. Clara had spent 15 years becoming indispensable to this family, not just as a servant, but as the emotional backbone that held their world together. She knew James's children better than he did, knew their fears, their secrets, their dependencies. And now she was making him face the reality of what life would be like without her there to clean up his messes, both literal and metaphorical. Ruth watched this exchange with growing amazement. She had never seen her mother speak to a white man this way, had never imagined such courage was possible. But Clara wasn't finished. She could see James wavering, his grip on the pistol becoming unsteady as he processed the implications of what she was saying. The children upstairs weren't just his offspring, they were his legacy, his claim to respectability in Savannah society. And Clara was showing him how fragile that foundation really was. "Elizabeth hasn't spoken to her governess in 3 weeks, Clara continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Did you know that? She only talks to me now, only trusts me. And little James, your precious heir, do you know what he asked me yesterday?" Clara paused, watching James's face carefully. "He asked me why his papa smells like other ladies when he comes home late at night. Such a smart boy, just like his father." James's hand began to shake, and Clara saw her opening. These weren't idle threats or desperate bluffs. These were the accumulated observations of a woman who had been invisible for so long that people forgot she had eyes and ears. She had seen James stumbling home drunk from his visits to the warehouse. She had washed the unfamiliar perfume from his clothes. She had comforted children who sensed their father's absence even when he was physically present. "You need me," Clara said simply, and the truth of it hung in the air like smoke. "You've always needed me. Who else knows where you keep your gambling debts hidden? Who else knows about the letters from the bank threatening foreclosure? Who else knows that half your field slaves haven't been fed properly in weeks because you spent their food money at the races?" Each revelation hit James like a physical blow, reminding him that Clara wasn't just a servant but a keeper of secrets. Ruth stood up from her chair, moving slowly toward her mother. The initial shock of their reunion was wearing off, replaced by something stronger and more dangerous: hope. For the first time in 4 years, Ruth was seeing her mother not as a victim but as a force of nature, someone capable of standing up to the man who had controlled both their lives for so long. The transformation was remarkable, and even James seemed to sense it. "Mama," Ruth whispered, reaching out to touch Clara's arm. The contact sent electricity through both women, a connection that had been severed by sale and separation but never truly broken. Clara looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just the damage that had been done but the strength that remained. Ruth had survived 4 years of whatever horrors James had subjected her to, and she was still standing, still fighting. James watched this reunion with growing panic. He could see his control slipping away, could feel the careful balance of power he had maintained for years beginning to collapse. The pistol in his hand felt heavy, useless against the force of a mother's love reunited with her child. He had made a critical error in bringing Ruth back to the plantation, had underestimated the bonds that slavery could bend but never truly break. "The warehouse," Clara said, her eyes never leaving James's face. "Where are the keys?" This wasn't a request anymore. It was a demand, backed by years of accumulated knowledge and the newfound power of moral authority. Clara had crossed a line tonight, had moved from servant to equal, and there was no going back. James looked back and forth between Clara and Ruth, calculating his options. He could shoot them both, but that would leave him with bodies to dispose of and children upstairs who would ask questions. He could try to maintain the fiction that Ruth was just another business transaction, but Clara had already made it clear she knew too much for that deception to hold. Or he could attempt to negotiate, to find some middle ground that would satisfy Clara while protecting his own interests. "What do you want?" he asked finally, lowering the pistol slightly. The question was an admission of defeat, a recognition that Clara now held cards he couldn't afford to ignore, but Clara's answer surprised him. "I want you to let me save them," she said quietly. "All of them. Every girl in that warehouse, every daughter stolen from her mother. I want you to give me the keys and walk away." The scope of Clara's demand was staggering. She wasn't just asking for her daughter's freedom, but for the liberation of James's entire operation. James laughed, a bitter sound that echoed strangely in the candle-lit study. "You're insane. Do you have any idea how much money is tied up in that warehouse? Those girls represent months of investment, contracts with buyers in 3 states. I can't just let them go." But even as he spoke, Clara could see him doing the mathematics in his head, weighing the cost of compliance against the price of exposure. "Then we have a problem," Clara said, and her voice carried a finality that made both James and Ruth look at her with new understanding. Clara had made her choice, had crossed over from victim to agent of justice. The woman who had spent 15 years keeping this family's secrets was now prepared to use those secrets as weapons. Ruth stepped closer to her mother, and Clara felt the warmth of her daughter's presence like a physical shield. Together, they faced James across the room, 2 women who had been treated as property but had somehow maintained their humanity. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. The master with his gun and his authority stood alone, while the slaves stood together, backed by moral certainty and desperate love. "There's another option," Clara said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You could disappear tonight. Take whatever money you can carry and run. Leave the plantation, leave Georgia, leave us all behind. Start over somewhere else where no one knows your name or your crimes." The suggestion was both mercy and ultimatum. Clara was offering James a chance at redemption, a way out that didn't require bloodshed. James considered this proposal, and Clara could see him weighing the appeal of escape against the humiliation of abandonment. Everything he had built in Savannah, his reputation, his social standing, his children's inheritance would be left behind. But the alternative was exposure, scandal, and possibly prison or worse. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "And if I refuse?" James asked, though they all knew the answer. Clara had been clear about the consequences of noncompliance. She would tell everything she knew to anyone who would listen. The wives of other plantation owners, the ministers, the newspaper editors, the authorities in Atlanta. James's crimes would become public knowledge, destroying not just him but his entire family. Clara looked up at the ceiling, where she could imagine the sleeping forms of the 6 children she had raised. Mary, Elizabeth, James Jr., Thomas, Catherine, and baby William, all innocent of their father's sins but destined to bear the consequences. Did they deserve to lose everything because of James's choices? Did they deserve to grow up knowing their father was a monster? "The children," Clara said finally. "What happens to them?" This question had been lurking beneath everything else, the moral complexity that made Clara's situation so impossible. She could destroy James, could save her daughter and the other girls in the warehouse, but the price would be paid by innocents who had never chosen their circumstances any more than she had chosen hers. James saw the hesitation in Clara's eyes and pressed his advantage. "Exactly. You destroy me, you destroy them. Mary's nightmares will become real. Elizabeth will never trust anyone again. The boys will grow up knowing their father was a criminal and their mother was a fool who trusted him. Is that what you want? Is your revenge worth their suffering?" The psychological cruelty of this argument was breathtaking. James was using Clara's own maternal instincts against her, turning her love for his children into a weapon to protect himself. But he had miscalculated. Clara's love for those children was real, but it wasn't unlimited. It couldn't override her love for her own daughter or her moral obligation to the other girls suffering in his warehouse. Ruth watched her mother struggle with this impossible choice and felt her heart breaking. She could see Clara torn between competing loyalties, between the children she had raised and the daughter she had borne. Ruth made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "Mama," Ruth said softly, "burn it down." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a prayer, like a curse. "Burn it all down. The house, the warehouse, everything. Let them all start over with nothing, just like we have to, just like all those other girls will have to." Ruth's proposal was radical, destructive, and somehow perfectly just. Clara stared at her daughter, seeing in Ruth's face an echo of her own transformation. The girl who had been sold into horror had emerged with a clarity that cut through all moral complexity. If the system couldn't be reformed, if justice couldn't be achieved through negotiation or exposure, then perhaps destruction was the only option left. James backed away from them, raising the pistol again. "You're both insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Clara could see him realizing that he was facing something he had never encountered before, enslaved people who were no longer afraid of death, who had found something worth dying for. The standoff continued for several heartbeats, 3 people frozen in a moment that would determine the fate of everyone in the house. Clara looked at James, then at Ruth, then up at the ceiling where 6 children slept peacefully, unaware that their world was about to change forever. She thought about the girls in the warehouse, about all the daughters who had been stolen from their mothers, about the system that had created and sustained these horrors. Then Clara made her choice, the choice that would define not just her own legacy, but the legacy of everyone touched by this night. She smiled, an expression both terrible and beautiful, and James knew that whatever happened next would change everything forever. Clara moved toward James's desk with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving his face. The candlelight flickered across her features, casting shadows that made her appear both familiar and strange, like the woman James had known for 15 years was being replaced by someone entirely different. "You're going to give me those keys," she said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere James had never seen before. "And then what?" James asked, his grip tightening on the pistol. "You'll free a dozen girls and think you've changed the world. There are hundreds more, Clara, thousands across Georgia, across the South. This is bigger than one warehouse, bigger than one plantation. You can't save them all." His words were meant to discourage her, to make her see the futility of resistance, but they had the opposite effect. Clara's smile grew wider, more dangerous. "You're right," she said, reaching across the desk to pick up one of the candles. "I can't save them all, but I can make sure you never hurt another girl again, and I can make sure everyone in Savannah knows exactly what kind of man James Ashworth really is." The candle flame danced in her hand, casting moving shadows on the wall behind her. Ruth watched her mother with a mixture of pride and terror. She could see Clara transforming before her eyes, shedding 15 years of enforced submission like an old dress. The woman holding that candle wasn't the same person who had tucked the Ashworth children into bed an hour ago. This was someone who had been pushed beyond her limits, who had found strength in the very depths of despair. James backed away from the desk, keeping the pistol trained on Clara. "You're talking about murder," he said, his voice beginning to crack under the pressure. "Cold-blooded murder of innocent children. Is that who you've become? A killer of babies?" The accusation was designed to wound, to make Clara confront the moral implications of what she was considering. But Clara had already wrestled with those demons. She looked up at the ceiling again, thinking of Mary's nightmares, of Elizabeth's trust, of little James's questions about his father. "Those children are innocent," she said quietly. "Just like my daughter was innocent. Just like all those girls in your warehouse are innocent. But innocence doesn't protect anyone from the choices of monsters, does it?" The philosophical debate was interrupted by a sound from upstairs. Footsteps, light and hesitant, moving across the floor above them. All three adults froze, listening. Clara recognized the particular rhythm immediately. Mary Ashworth, age 7, was awake and moving around. Probably another nightmare, probably looking for Clara to comfort her. The timing was both perfect and terrible. "Mary," James whispered, and for the first time since Clara had entered the study, she heard real emotion in his voice. Not the calculated cruelty or desperate fear he had shown before, but genuine love for his daughter. It was the crack in his armor Clara had been waiting for. "Call to her," Clara said, holding the candle closer to a pile of papers on James's desk. "Tell her to go back to bed. Tell her everything is fine. One last lie from her loving father." The papers began to smolder slightly, the edges turning brown in the heat. Clara could see legal documents, property deeds, correspondence with buyers in New Orleans, evidence of years of systematic human trafficking. James looked at the burning papers, then at Clara, then toward the ceiling where his daughter's footsteps were growing closer to the staircase. "Mary," he called out, his voice artificially steady, "go back to bed, sweetheart. Papa is just doing some work." The lie came easily, as all his lies did, but Clara could hear the strain underneath. "Papa," Mary's voice drifted down from the top of the stairs, small and frightened. "I had another bad dream. Where's Clara? I want Clara." The child's trust, her immediate request for the woman who had been more mother to her than her own deceased parent, hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Clara felt tears starting in her eyes for the first time that night. Not tears of fear or anger, but tears of genuine grief for what was about to be lost. She loved Mary Ashworth, had loved all the Ashworth children despite everything their father had done. They were victims too, innocent casualties of a system that corrupted everything it touched. "Clara's busy right now," James called up, his voice beginning to shake. Just go back to bed. I'll come tuck you in soon." But Mary didn't move away from the stairs. Clara could hear her small feet on the top step, could imagine her peering down into the darkness of the first floor, trying to understand why the adults were awake in the middle of the night. Ruth moved toward the study door, her hand reaching for the handle. "Let me go to her," she whispered to Clara. "Let me get her away from here." It was an offer born of compassion, a recognition that whatever was about to happen shouldn't involve an innocent child. But Clara shook her head. "No," Clara said firmly. "She stays upstairs. They all stay upstairs." The decision was final, non-negotiable. Clara had made her choice about what needed to happen, and she wouldn't be swayed by sympathy or second thoughts. The children would be protected, but they wouldn't be witnesses to their father's final judgment. James saw the determination in Clara's eyes and made his own desperate calculation. He could try to shoot her, but the sound would wake the entire house and bring servants running. He could try to negotiate further, but Clara had clearly moved beyond the reach of bargaining. Or he could make one final appeal to whatever remained of the woman who had served his family faithfully for 15 years. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I know I've done terrible things. I know I've hurt people, hurt your daughter, hurt other families. But those children upstairs, they love you. You're the only mother they've ever known. Don't make them pay for my sins." It was perhaps the most honest thing James had ever said, a moment of genuine vulnerability in a life built on deception and exploitation. Clara considered his words, feeling the weight of 15 years of shared history, of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, of scraped knees bandaged and bedtime stories told. She thought of Mary's small hand in hers during thunderstorms, of Elizabeth's proud smile when she mastered a piano piece, of the boys' laughter echoing through the halls. These memories were real, precious, and about to be destroyed by the fire she was preparing to set. "They'll survive," Clara said finally, and her voice carried both sorrow and steel. "Children are stronger than adults think. They'll grieve, they'll heal, and they'll grow up in a world where their father can't hurt anyone else. That's the best gift I can give them." The papers on James's desk were burning in earnest now, flames licking at the edges of his criminal empire. Ruth watched the fire spread and felt something like peace settling over her. For 4 years she had lived with the knowledge that there was no justice for people like her, no court that would hear her testimony, no law that would protect her from men like James Ashworth. But fire was different. Fire didn't care about legal property rights or social hierarchies. Fire was democracy in its purest form, consuming everything equally. James raised the pistol again, pointing it directly at Clara's heart. "I won't let you do this," he said, but his hand was shaking so badly that Clara doubted he could hit her even at close range. "I won't let you destroy everything I've built." The desperation in his voice was complete now, the voice of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "You already destroyed it," Clara replied, stepping closer to him despite the gun. "You destroyed it the moment you decided that other people's children were merchandise to be sold. You destroyed it when you looked me in the eye for 4 years and lied about what happened to Ruth. You destroyed it when you chose money over mercy, profit over people." Each accusation was punctuated by another paper catching fire, another piece of evidence turning to ash. The flames were spreading now, reaching toward the curtains that hung beside the study windows. Clara could feel the heat on her face, could smell the smoke beginning to fill the room. Soon it would be too late for anyone to stop what she had started. The point of no return was approaching, and Clara welcomed it like an old friend. Mary's voice came from the staircase again, more frightened now. "Papa, I smell smoke. Is something burning?" The innocence in that question, the complete trust that her father would protect her from any danger, nearly broke Clara's resolve. But she thought of Ruth's tears, of the other girls in the warehouse, of all the daughters who would never come home. "Tell her to wake the others," Clara said to James, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Tell them all to get dressed and go outside. Tell them the house is on fire and they need to run to the neighbors." It was mercy, Perhaps the last mercy Clara would ever show, but it was also strategy. She wanted the children safe, but she also wanted witnesses to what happened next. James stared at her for a long moment, then called up the stairs. "Mary, wake your brothers and sisters. Get dressed quickly and go to the Hendersons' house. The study is on fire." His voice carried the authority of absolute command, the tone that had never been questioned in 15 years of slavery. But now it was serving Clara's purposes rather than his own. The sound of running footsteps erupted from upstairs as the children responded to their father's emergency instructions. Clara could hear Mary calling to Elizabeth, Elizabeth shaking the boys awake, everyone moving with the swift efficiency that came from well-practiced household routines. They would be safe, Clara told herself. They would survive this night and grow up to be better than their father. Ruth moved to stand beside her mother as the fire spread across James's desk and began climbing the walls. The two women stood together, watching 15 years of secrets and crimes turn to smoke. "What about us?" Ruth asked quietly. "What happens to us when the house burns?" It was a practical question, but also a philosophical one. Would they run? Would they stay? Would they face the consequences of their choice? Clara looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the broken girl who had been sold into horror but the strong woman who had survived it. "We run," Clara said simply. "We run fast and far, and we start over somewhere else, together this time." It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a plan built on hope rather than despair, on love rather than revenge. James lowered his pistol, finally understanding that he had lost completely. The fire was beyond stopping now. His documents were ash, his criminal network was exposed, and his children were fleeing into the night. "You've killed us all," he said, but there was no anger left in his voice, only exhaustion. "No," Clara replied, taking Ruth's hand and moving toward the study door. "I've set us all free." The flames roared behind them as they stepped into the hallway, and Clara didn't look back. She had spent 15 years looking backward, remembering what was lost, mourning what was taken. Now she was looking forward, toward whatever future she and Ruth could build together. The Ashworth mansion burned for 3 hours that December night in 1824, taking with it the evidence of years of systematic human trafficking and the comfortable lies that had sustained a family's wealth. The 6 Ashworth children survived, taken in by neighbors and eventually by relatives in Charleston. They grew up knowing their father died in the fire, but never learning the full truth about his crimes. Clara and Ruth disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, 2 women walking toward freedom with nothing but each other and the clothes on their backs. The warehouse by the river burned too, though no one could prove Clara had set that fire. 17 girls were found wandering the roads outside Savannah the next morning, alive and free, but with no memory of how they had escaped. Some said it was divine intervention. Others whispered about a woman with a candle who had appeared in their dreams, telling them to run. Clara's story spread throughout Georgia's slave quarters like wildfire itself, inspiring other acts of resistance and rebellion. She became a legend, a symbol of what was possible when love burned hotter than fear. Some said she and Ruth made it to Philadelphia, others claimed they went to Canada. A few insisted they had seen Clara's ghost still walking through the burned ruins of the Ashworth mansion, making sure no new horrors took root there. Truth was simpler and more powerful than any ghost story. Clara had chosen love over safety, justice over comfort, action over acceptance. In doing so, she had proven that even in the darkest moments, even under the most oppressive systems, the human spirit could still burn bright enough to light the way to freedom. Her fire had consumed more than just a house. It had consumed the lie that some people were property, the fiction that cruelty was natural, the myth that resistance was impossible. On cold December nights in Georgia, when the wind whistles through the ruins of old plantations and the shadows dance like flames, some folks still say they can hear Clara's voice carried on the breeze. Not angry or vengeful, but calm and certain, speaking words that echo across generations. Some fires destroy, but others purify. Some secrets are too heavy to carry, and some loves are too strong to break. Remember that when the monsters come calling. Remember that when the world tells you to accept what cannot be changed. Remember that sometimes the only way forward is through the flames. If you want to hear more stories of resistance and courage that history tried to forget, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose love over fear. These stories matter. These voices deserve to be heard. And Clara's fire still burns bright, waiting to inspire the next generation of people brave enough to choose justice over safety.